on social media? Do we have a hashtag?
We do, yeah. I just posted it in the chat for everyone. So if you want to tweet along and post back today, please tag us at Quality of Life UK using the hashtags Let's Build Quality of Life and Build Back Better.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Good. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I want to thank everybody for joining this event, which is organised by the Quality of Life Foundation. I'll start off, as there are still people joining, with the housekeeping stuff, which is no longer about fire and toilets. It's about other stuff, since we're in the virtual world. First, quick reminder to panelists: keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking, and even more important, to unmute yourself when you do want to speak, so that we can hear you. And there'll be a prize for the first person who we have to tell to unmute. It'll be me. Because it happens in literally every meeting all day long. Second, audience members, later on you'll have the chance to ask questions for our panel. So if you'd like to do so, the procedure is to add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll select questions as we go along. I think you can probably add them to the chat stream as well, but it's better if you use the Q&A function, because then we'll know where they are and they'll be in one place. And you can use the chat to discuss more generally. You can do that anytime, so feel free to do it ahead of time or later. We'll just pick questions based on what's interesting, rather than sort of first come, first served. Third, if you want to message us or ask us a question privately during the webinar, you can. You can send a message to the panelists only in the chat box by selecting from the blue drop down, and that will then be picked up by myself or one of my colleagues. And finally, we are, as you can see, recording this webinar, and I just wanted to make you aware of that. We're still short of one of our panel members. So I'm just going to push on, as we aren't going to have all the time in the world. I'm going to sort of start by introducing the session in a little more detail, and hopefully Matt Bell will arrive at some point. So I'm going to start in a minute with an introduction to the Quality of Life Foundation, and then there'll be a panel discussion with our hopefully three panel members, and then I'll open up to questions from the audience. So think about what questions you want to ask and put them in the box whenever you're ready. And also, I would say that if you want to ask a question to one of our panel in particular, then just mention it when you put your question forward, and I'll direct the question to that person for you. So I'd like to talk about the Quality of Life Foundation just to begin with. The Quality of Life Foundation has been set up to raise people's quality of life by making well-being central to the way we create and care for our homes and communities. We want to see more homes and communities that prioritise people's physical, social and psychological well-being over the long term. Probably everyone will be aware of a raft of research recently into the quality of our new housing environments, and one in particular described these as generally being of mediocre or poor quality, and that's what the Quality of Life Foundation is seeking to help redress. Recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has placed new challenges on our built environment, as many people have spent much more time in their homes. At the moment, cities are re-examining how people can move around safely amid ongoing COVID restrictions, and shifts are taking place at potentially a seismic level in terms of the way people work, with many companies now announcing that they're looking again at whether they manage and maintain large corporate headquarters, or whether they trust their workforce to work remotely, and hopefully taking pressure off our transport infrastructure in doing so. So it's a really interesting moment, and it's more important than ever that we focus now on what people need for their homes and communities, and how we look at places being more resilient, cleaner, safer and mutually supportive, and how we can improve people's well-being in the longer term. And of course, we need to do this in a way that acknowledges and addresses the ongoing urgency of the climate imperative. More recently still, the Black Lives Matter movement has highlighted the basic inequalities in our society that continue to persist. And it points to another challenge, which is how we improve the quality of life equitably and for everyone. The Quality of Life Foundation is developing a framework for articulating how we think about quality of life in the built environment specifically. And that framework will help to organise our thinking as a foundation, and it will guide our future work. The framework is going to be structured around a series of themes. The first one is building places that foster a greater sense of control, and that's what the theme for this session is. So next I'd like to introduce our panelists. So first I'd like to introduce Vidhya Alakeson, who's the Chief Executive of Power to Change. Power to Change is an independent trust established in 2015 to support and grow community-led businesses across England. It's an organisation that's genuinely at the cutting edge of working out how to give people more control over their existence, over their places and over their livelihoods, and how to empower people fundamentally. Many of the projects and places that I've come across where good things are happening seem to have power to change involved at some level. You know, somewhere involved is always power to change. And I think before joining Power to Change, Vidhya worked for the Resolution Foundation and for the NHS, and has tremendous range of perspectives, and it's great to have you here today. Next, I'd like to welcome Jo Negrini, who is Chief Executive of London Borough of Croydon, and who has extensive experience in working in regeneration and planning in London. In Croydon, not only does she lead a council in one of London's more diverse and dynamic boroughs, but also it's a place where things are happening in the built environment, and brick by brick, the council's housing arm has achieved recognition for putting quality and design at the heart of its agenda. So Jo, great to have you here with us today. And finally, Matt Bell, who is just perfectly sort of sidled in just at the perfect moment. Hello, Matt. Is Director of Corporate Affairs at Grosvenor, and his job is to help Grosvenor in the way that they engage with communities and stakeholders and people. And Grosvenor have stood out over the last year for me as an organisation that has recognised that we have real problems in the sector about how developers are perceived, how we are trusted or not by stakeholders, members of the community, and the people that we home and work with otherwise. And I think that Grosvenor stand out as, you know, seeking to understand what's going on there and to address that lack of trust. So Matt, it's great to have you here as well today. And finally, I'm Jonny Anstead. I'm one of the board members of the Quality of Life Foundation, but in my day job, as it were, I'm a founding director of a development company called Town. We work quite closely with communities in trying to build better places, and for those who aren't too familiar with it, we built a scheme called Marmalade Lane in Cambridge, where we worked very closely with between 20 and 30 households who wanted to make a new neighbourhood for themselves as a co-housing scheme. And so we went through a really interesting process of working alongside not only our professional design team, but with the actual people who would end up living in this place. And for me, that was a process that really shone a light on what it meant to offer people more control over a process and over the way that things were designed. And it meant sometimes that that we had to find new ways of doing things as professionals. We had to work less in silos and more in an integrated way, because, you know, real people don't actually work in the silos of architecture and engineering and M&D and so on. And we sort of needed to work in a much more integrated and different sort of a way from usual. But also, I suppose that the other thing that has been fascinating to me is that through the process, it has meant that that there's a kind of social capital that's been embedded in that project, which is actually nothing to do with us. It's been about the people who've been involved from the, you know, from the resident side, and that was really cemented through a process of working together. But at the end, it's meant that through the challenges that now face communities, any community, on an ongoing basis, they have a sort of embodied resilience that enables them to tackle those things together because they know one another and they trust one another. They have ways of deciding things together. And under COVID, for example, they have been much less isolated than many of us, and being able to sort of tackle some of their problems, like getting out to the shops, just hasn't been a problem because somebody will always be there to do it for the others, or they've been bulk purchasing as a club, and just practical ways of solving some of the challenges that we've all felt over the last few months. So I'm really interested in this as a topic, and I think that it's going to be a great discussion because we're all coming at it from different and hopefully interesting, positive perspectives. So I'd like to start by directing a first question, which is about COVID, to Matt. Since you were the last in, Matt, so I'm going to ask you the first question. And I'd like to ask you, what impact do you think COVID-19 has had on the way we view our surroundings? And how has it affected the way that and more importantly, the control that we have over our surroundings?
Thanks, Jonny. Well, the cliche is that neighbourhoods have suddenly become more important to us, isn't it? We spend much more time at home. We've discovered local shops, local parks, people who live on our street. And I guess that's probably true. I'm personally completely sick of local and I seriously need to get out. But a greater sense of belonging in a neighbourhood has to be a good thing, doesn't it? So more conversations and more sharing and more mutual support. And I think there's some interesting ONS data, which I tend to follow quite a lot, which shows that anxiety across Britain is down 20% since the start of the lockdown, which is interesting, right? So question is whether has more local made us less anxious. But when you ask about control, I think it's fundamentally about power. And there's a different set of issues if you're talking about making places to if you're talking about managing them. And at one level, I'm also not totally sure that actually most people want to be empowered to oversee sort of landscape maintenance regimes and district heating systems and running the community hall and your service charge negotiations. So everybody knows there's a few local heroes always, isn't there? But to be honest, not many. What I do think most people want is to feel connected. I think people want to feel connected to each other in very practical ways and to the place where you live really in quite emotional ways. So I think for us, there's probably a hierarchy of issues we need to tussle with today. I think at a national level, control starts with devolution. You go from Whitehall to cities and from councils down to wards and parishes. And to be honest, I don't think anything's changed here during the pandemic. I don't think this is really an administration hell-bent on decentralisation. And levelling up isn't the same as devolution either, is it? And then when you get down to the neighbourhood scale, I think we need to disentangle those ideas about empowering people from connecting them. So we probably need to empower people more in the making of neighbourhoods, but not everybody equally. So again, if I was being really candid, I'm not frankly very interested in giving more power to 10 elderly people in the community, but I'm really passionate about giving young adults more power, say, over the design of public realm. And then when it comes to managing neighbourhoods, I think there's probably a real appetite for greater connection with the people and the places where we live. And then the more connected we are, the more experience we have of each other's lives, and the more you get to tackle issues like race, for example. And to close, I think there's probably a huge creative space here into which councils, property companies, and the social sector could step.
Thank you, Matt. I want to just circle in on the bit that you said about the fact that you're less than persuaded that it's automatic, that more control is always a good thing. And I think that what you were saying was that it isn't necessarily true, or not to be challenged, that if you keep on giving people more control, they continue to be happier, and also that people have different levels of appetite for control, and we shouldn't assume that everyone is the same and fancies kind of some of the more difficult aspects of what control really means. I suppose that my thinking has been sort of slightly influenced by a kind of very deep kind of community-led experience, where probably you have quite a quite exceptional bunch of people who have a higher than normal threshold for taking on that control and kind of really do want to do that, including the kind of more mundane things. But I think that I can sort of see that what you're saying probably is true, that it's not necessarily true. So, you know, for everyone. So what do you think are the kind of right levels? And I wanted to kind of put, Vidhya, I wanted to bring you in on this, because actually you're kind of at the, well, I don't know how you describe it, but maybe you'd represent a sort of grassroots sort of voice on this, or somebody who kind of talks to real people all the time. Do you think it's true that people don't all want to have more control or maximum control?
You're probably expecting me to disagree with Matt, but I think I agree. But I think what people do want, so I think Matt's right there. There's a core of people who do really want control and who are willing to be on the committees, etc. But I think what we see in the difference that community businesses make is that the people who have control and who make the decisions are deeply connected with other people where they live, and therefore those people feel that decisions are made in their best interest. There's a trust between the people who are running the community business and the rest of the community. So I think Matt's completely right that not everybody wants to be on committees, giving their evenings up to doing, you know, participating in a very active way. But I think what people do really want to see, and I think this is where the challenge is with people who currently hold power, is that sense that is the power being held by people who I trust and who are going to act in my best interest. And I think that's where, and I mean, I've been to Marmalade Lane and it is exceptional, but I don't think that most communities can function at the level of depth of engagement and participation that you get in a place like Marmalade Lane. I mean, it's a wonderful place, and I think what you've done there is incredible. But I think that is quite an exceptional experience. But I think some people do want to be in control and to really drive things, and other people want to feel that those in control are connected to them and trust, and that they trust them. And I think that's what's broken down.
Thank you, Vidhya. So turning back to Matt, just to finish on this one, I guess with a sort of small supplementary question, have you got some examples as to the kind of ways that you can give people the right level of control and the right level of being able to connect with one another that kind of can bring that to life, kind of what feels comfortable or effective for you?
I guess the difference I'm trying to point to is between connection and control. So I think there's huge appetite for people to be connected. And I think that's the insight you can take from the pandemic. Yeah, people absolutely want to feel a sense of connection with people around them. And when you get more local, you probably get less anxiety, for example. The issue of control, I'm less convinced by. I think it's not that most people, it's that hardly anybody has the time or incentive or skill set to get meaningfully involved. So I wouldn't want us to go down a rabbit hole there, born out of some theology, I guess I'm saying. And then the second point is about that difference between the kind of planning and regen story, where there's no question for me that power is unequally distributed, and there are the things that we could do to change that. But I wouldn't want to, sometimes people get into a very kind of superficial, so it's less power to the developer and more power to the community, when actually the community is obviously a very nuanced environment, and power is not evenly distributed, nor should it be necessarily within that community. So let's understand the game of neighbourhood management is very different from the business of planning and regen. And control plays into those two things very differently. I guess Grosvenor is interesting like that because only about 1/3 of our business is development and 2/3 is about active stewardship. And the things that excite people to get involved in those two different things are completely different.
Thank you, Matt. That's really helpful. I'm going to move on to the next question in that case. So I'm going to put this one to Joe, bring you in here, Joe. How do you think we can encourage diversity, equality and fairness in building and create places that people feel an equal sense of belonging and control within?
Well, I've been, hi to everyone, and thanks a lot for inviting me to sit on the panel today. It's been really interesting watching the Thatcher documentary. I don't know whether anybody's been watching it, about her reign, and there was a really interesting episode, and which was about the early 1980s and the riots, and the why that happened and what was building up at the time leading up to 1981 and the original riots, and actually what came after it, which was Heseltine's view of inner city regeneration, which I've been in my career very influenced by, where you would look at whole areas in their entirety. So it wasn't just about built environment, but the early regeneration programs around the 80s and 90s. That's how old I am. I actually worked in them. We're all about actually looking at a place in its totality, and that wasn't just about buildings, but it was also about services. And it was also about recognizing in the 80s and 90s that local was important, and there was a context for people's lives, and it was about their local area. And if you can kind of take anything away from those big regeneration programs, they were right, because it's been really interesting as a planner, but also as the chief exec of a big borough, a very big borough in London, watching the pandemic and being responsible for the response to the pandemic on one hand, but also looking at the issues that the pandemic is raising and what do we need to take away from this experience and change. And I think it's no surprise that the areas that have been hit hardest by COVID, I'm just going to speak parochial in London here, have been those areas of high density, areas of high levels of deprivation. And that obviously has had a disproportionate impact on BME communities in London, and is telling you something about the problem that we've got to try and fix. Because I think the issue of control, and we can talk about, you know, I think Matt was saying about the nature of control, that you have to let it go to give it to somebody else. But there's a thing for me about, which is a different sense of control, which is about, you know, there are some very loud voices in the community now who have come out about the disproportionality of COVID and how it's impacted on different communities, and Black Lives Matter, and about disproportionality of COVID offences from the police, and a whole range of different things that are saying that there are voices that need to be heard. And I think having your voice heard is different from having the control. And having your voice heard and acted upon, and that's where there's always the tension. It's about, we have all this consultation, people give us their voice, they tell us what they want, and then we do something different. I mean, the issue for me is, how do you give, create an environment where people's voices are heard, but more importantly, how do you take their voices and you actually act upon them? And I think all of the things around COVID that I'm learning as I'm kind of watching, you know, we're not out of it yet. We're still in the middle of it. My teams are still delivering services to shielded residents until the money's pulled out of that. I do think that there are some huge lessons for us about the importance of local, and getting back into, in my mind, to first principles around places, which is, it's not just about the physical environment, but it has a huge impact, as it has had, on the whole sense of what amenity means. The people without balconies, no access to outdoor space, trying to deal with the pandemic in 14 square meters of permitted development space. You know, there's huge issues about space standards, huge issues about amenity space, access to parks, open spaces, huge. You know, it's been fantastic, the rise of the local park. How fantastic is that? Breeding a sense of community and sense of belonging and feeling like you're part of something. But as we kind of move forward, and I think as we're coming out of COVID, and as we're having the conversations, as I'm having with my Black staff and with Black residents, in terms of what all this means, there needs to be an approach which is about having that. I'm not saying having a conversation, because people say that all the time. It's like, we know what needs to change. We know what good places. Grosvenor knows what it means. You know, there's a lot of people who are listening in today know what are the ingredients of a great place. But we've just got to do it. You know, we know what, we just have to do it. So people are saying to us that all these things are really important. And as we move, I think there's going to be a huge opportunity about the rise of the district centre, the future role of retail in district centres, thinking about Vidhya and the work that she's doing. You know, it's a fantastic opportunity for us to actually recalibrate some of the dynamics around that. And I think, you know, on one level, Matt is absolutely right. It's not about the control, but the normal way of doing things is about a proposal from a developer that comes into a local authority that says, we want to do this, we want this many housing units, and we'll create this kind of landscaping, additional resource, here's your section 106, bit of affordable housing. And that approach is wrong. And I think what we're trying to do in Croydon, which has been really, you know, there's always got to be optimism. And what has worked really well in the pandemic has been about the relationships, the absolute relationships between the NHS, the council, mutual aid groups, food banks, all of the people that are providing support to shielded residents particularly, which is the priority. And using that energy and harnessing an approach to localities, which is what we're doing with the NHS in Croydon, which is about saying we're going to work with that population and we're going to think about what services they need, what they want their environment to look like, what's important on a very local basis. So rather than having big local plans, we will have 16. But then, you know, this is putting a new dimension to neighbourhood planning, which is not just about people's built environment, but how that impacts on their lives and what services need to run in tandem with that. So I think the way that you deal with things is like the built environment doesn't solve all ills. Actually, as you said, Jonny, right at the very beginning, there's a whole network of complex relationships and services that interface with each other to create great places. But I think we need to be looking back at, you know, how those early regeneration programs looked at people's housing, they looked at their employment, they looked at all of these things on a locality basis with the built environment and the planning around those things as being a way of really driving proper change, but having to get back to the original point around, you know, to have to take what we know from what people want to see happening and just doing it.
Thank you, Jo. That's really helpful, and I especially like the idea of built environment and services being super intertwined rather than two separate things. Yeah. I think that we see built environment as built and services being somebody else's problem, or vice versa. One follow-up question on that was, if you're going to do that in an integrated way and at the kind of finer grain scale that you were just sort of describing, what are the relevant organisations that you channel that energy through? Is it the council and sub-teams of the council? Is it existing organisations that come from the bottom up, or what?
Yeah, well, I think sustainable neighbourhoods is not about the council. You know, I would say that, but I don't, you know, the council are good at some stuff, but actually to make things last, there is a real opportunity. So as a real example of that, what we're doing now is like literally, we have a group of voluntary sector organisations, infrastructure bodies that work with a whole range of community groups and voluntary organisations, and have now reached out to the mutual aid groups, of which there are numerous, as there is across London and across the country now, to actually work with us. And my job and our job at the council is to get the integration between us and the NHS. Because, you know, the ideal in my mind of public service in the future is it doesn't matter who delivers it to you. It could be the voluntary sector, it could be a mutual aid group, it could be us, it could be the NHS. And to have an environment where actually you create a total package for people in an area and you bring all of those networks in. What's fundamental as well to this, and Vidhya will be happily I'm saying that, but fundamental to that are these smaller district centres, which, you know, we talk about a polycentric London with metropolitan centres. It's almost getting down to every borough's almost got polycentric around their centres. And there's a whole raft of different ways that you can bring in local businesses into that. We can start thinking about the changing nature of the high street, what needs to be on those high streets. There's huge opportunities now to harness all that energy, and we're practically doing that with all of those groups to say, look, we know from what the data in your area, these are the key issues we want to tackle, whether it's poor housing, high unemployment, whether it's a whole range of other things, poor quality open space, public realm, issues in your district centre. And we work collectively as a group of people to fix it.
Thank you, Jo. That's really helpful. Thank you. Vidhya, next question is for you. What happens when local people begin to lose a sense of control through redevelopment or other processes or things happening? What's there, and can you sort of describe what the impact is of that on people's quality of life?
And this is really well documented, and I'll kind of draw on, the Marmot Review being the seminal piece of work on the social determinants of health, points really clearly. So it's a decade old. It has been updated this year, and the findings are very much the same. But I mean, it finds very clear evidence that control, both at an individual level and at a community level, is a fundamental building block of well-being and health, and therefore the loss of control or a feeling of lack of control exacerbates poverty, poor health, leads to a whole set of negative impacts. And there was some really interesting work that Local Trust did, which is the organisation that runs Big Local, which is a programme of kind of community-led investment across England in some of the poorest parts of the country. And they did some really interesting research last year, which looked at what was the impact of a lack of control. They didn't use that terminology, but basically where there isn't an engaged, active community that really feels it has control over what happens locally, what does that mean? And they found sort of empirically that exacerbates other types of deprivation. So a lack of control might seem like a kind of conceptual idea, but actually has quite a significant impact on people's day-to-day lives. And I think a path to change, sort of what we see is, I suppose, the flip of that is what happens when local people decide that they want to take control. And I think coming back to Matt's point, I think our experience is slightly different. So I think when experts or other people frame the way in which people get to participate, I think you do get the same 10 people turning up who shout quite loudly but are not very representative of their local community. I think what we see is when local people define the challenge for themselves, so it's either responding to a local problem that they see as important, or trying to keep a service locally that they see as important, or trying to save a building or bring a building back into use that they value, you see much greater willingness for people to get involved, much greater participation. And that's, often community businesses are born out of a sense of lack of control, and people then coming together locally to take control again and move forward. And I suppose I would say from our experience, and we've now supported over 1,000 of these organisations across the country, it's not necessarily that they want to be doing they don't necessarily want to be involved at regeneration at scale, although I think there is a role for community organisations to be at the table in those sorts of processes. Often they want to take power over the things that really matter to them. So it may be that there is a particular building at the heart of their community that they really want to protect and that they really value. For them, the control is being able to decide what happens in that building, to be able to animate that space, to be able to be part of the decision making in that context. So I think this is a conversation about the built environment, and I think we can think about that in quite grand scale, about large regeneration projects. But I often think what communities are looking for is control and power over the things that really matter to them, and that isn't often necessarily the thing that's happening at scale. It might be a much smaller scale, keeping their library open, keeping their repurposing their town hall to actually meet the needs of young people locally, creating jobs for young people who would otherwise be leaving the area. Those sorts of things can create a sense of control and are ways in which communities can meaningfully take power and exercise power. I think often we're asking people to participate in processes that they actually have no great interest in, because it's not driven by them. It's us saying, here's the process, do you want to be involved? And actually won't act on what you say anyway. So unsurprisingly, they're not all that motivated to get involved.
Thank you, Vidhya. A lot of people have been talking about a similar sort of set of issues here, and I'd just like to bring that to a couple of questions. One is, well, observations and a question. We've all been part of those public engagement events where you're sort of standing around, either asking questions to a team or being part of the team, where you kind of, you sort of know that the motions are being gone through and you're sort of having conversations, but actually you're not really talking about fundamentally redesigning anything or changing very much, but it's the kind of process that you have to do to show that you've done your statement of community engagement, and those processes exist for sure. The second observation I have is about planning committees and elected members. One of the problems that I see, or that I'm aware of, is the fact that they're not representative of wider groups of people. I think the elected, the average age of elected members, whether at parish or local authority level, is around 60 years old, or older, maybe anyway, between 60 and 70 years old. And that was the Intergenerational Fairness Foundation that did that research. And I think there is a big question about with those two things in mind, about where control does reside. I want to slightly challenge or at least question the idea that control is a sort of infinite thing that everyone can have more of, and ask each of you just for a very quick position on this as to, is it true that all can have more control and be happy, or is giving one person more control, taking away a little control from somebody else, is control actually a finite resource that has to be reapportioned for a more equitable way of going about planning and delivering places? So I'm going to start off with Matt, as you touched on this earlier on. I'd just like to hear your take on that.
It's control and power over what? So down in Southwark, so where Grosvenor's got the biscuit factory site. So if you're taking some classical example, would be housing tenure, for instance. So from a borough perspective, social rented housing was completely key. You know, like, we need lots more of it. Talking to people in Bermondsey, 61% of whom live in social rented, they absolutely didn't want more social rented, and were very happy to say so. So who are you going to listen to? Yeah, probably on balance, personally, I would sit with the council there, taking a borough-wide perspective, and you'd probably, one way or the other, need to say to the community, actually, we're going to run with this, even if it's not what you want, because it's what Southwark as a whole needs. So that question of, so obviously power is finite, but it's also specific to certain choices and decisions, and it depends which they are. You could absolutely disempower developers quite helpfully at certain points in the process. It's interesting with, say, the whole business of estate regen referenda. My initial reaction when that policy came out was quite hesitant. And then I went and worked down a couple of years ago, well, last year and a half ago, on the Cambridge Road estate in Kingston, where they had to go through it. And God, it made us up our game. You know, we focused so much harder. The whole engagement process got so much more resource from the council and from the development team. And I'd be a massive fan now, because it empowered the residents to make a specific choice over a really clean question.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Matt. That's a brilliant direct experience of that. Thank you. Vidhya, do you want to just come in on that question? We've got a couple more minutes before we're going to turn it over to the audience.
I mean, I do think power is finite, so somebody has to give it up for somebody else to have more of it. But I don't think, you know, community-led activity is often presented as in conflict with local authorities. All of our experience is that community-led activity has to be enabled by local authorities to really succeed. They often hold the keys to making it successful. So I think you can have partnerships. You need to share power, which means that someone has to give some up for somebody else to have them, but you still need to work in a kind of partnership way. So it's not a case of everything community-led is chucking out government and other kinds of actors locally. But yeah, I do think it's finite.
Thank you, Vidhya. Sorry, and Joe, I told you I'd be the first person to do that. Joe.
It was almost me then, actually. I'm glad it was you. It's kind of almost like power sharing, isn't it? In some ways, around it, because I also think that, and it gets back to Matt's question about power and control over what. I mean, I do think that sometimes we approach the conversations in the wrong way. So, you know, examples of some of the dynamics that I've seen in my lifetime, where a developer will come in and say, what do you think about this really intensely developed bit of land next to you where we're doing flats, but there'll be some affordable housing in that? It's kind of like the wrong question, because you're going to get an immediate kind of reaction to the power that developer has. And it's about, how do you reset and create an environment? And I think you're right, Matt. I think developers have upped their games as a result. You know, there was a huge outcry in terms of the ballot piece, in terms of but only from some developers, in fact, not all developers. You know, the good developers who are doing and taking placemaking as a really fundamental part. You know, developers aren't a homogeneous group of people. You know, they all do things very differently. And I think, you know, it is about, for me, about thinking about how you have the right conversations with people, because most people, you know, this whole thing about representation, about councillors and all of these kind of things. The big questions for residents in Croydon at the moment is, how are you going to make sure I feel safe? That's the biggest question. It's not, I want control over what happens with that planning application or that. It's about, how are you going to make sure, if you actually ask people what they care most about today as a result of COVID, it's about their health, it's their families, and it's about feeling safe. And I do think that that's the starting point for the conversation about the built environment. It can't be about, what do you think about the development? Because it means that you walk into a immediately conflictual situation. So I do think, you know, it is about, how do you, it gets back to my original point about really hearing the voices in all of this, and making sure that, you know, the product is different.
I like your analogy to power sharing, Joe. I think that the way I set up the question, obviously kind of put one group against another and said that the decision around who has control and power needs to be a fight. I think that there's ways of reapportioning control in a way that aligns people's interests rather than puts them head to head. And I think that's kind of what's come out of the conversation with the three of you. I'm going to turn to a few of the questions from the audience. Any more questions will need to come in soon, because we're only going to get a chance to answer a few of them. I'm going to start, and I'm not going to get all of you to answer all of them, because we won't be able to cover very many at all. So I'm going to start off. I think this is a question for Joe. How do you go about identifying those in the community that are truly representative of the people that live there, while also being being willing to step up to the role? Is there a role for us to better empower those that need it most? Is that a question for Joe, or does somebody particularly want to answer it?
Well, it's kind of assumes a process where you go and kind of do a selection around the community and make sure it's representative. I guess if you're trying to connect with people, I think, around development and environment, actually some of the best ways of doing that is through talking to them via, you know, if you want, particularly in areas that are much more deprived, some of our links are through food banks. Some of our links are through voluntary and community organisations who are working with them. Some of them, which is how you get to the kind of heart of some of the problems. It's like people care about their day-to-day existence rather than what's going to be built in 5 years. And I think some of the ways of actually having the conversation is about things that really mean a lot to them, and then think about their local area as part of that, as opposed to going and doing a kind of a selection process like councillors, if you like. It's about actually really thinking about what's important to those communities in that space, who are best equipped to reach out and to make sure you're talking to the right people. And I think sometimes it's not the council.
Vidhya coming in here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and so this is one of the things, I was on the government's High Street Expert panel in 2018, and one of the things that we sort of fought quite hard to get through in that process was the idea that place leadership isn't held by the council. So, you know, obviously the council has a huge role to play, but you can be a leader of your place through being in a significant community organisation or voluntary sector organisation. So I think it's about, for me, it's not about making sure that we get the representation always on the council, which, I mean, not that that is a good thing, but it's also about broadening out the concept of who really leads in a place. And actually you need to think much more broadly than just the council in terms of whose views matter and who really represents the people of a place. It's a much wider set of people than the people who are elected as councillors, I would argue.
Thank you, Vidhya. I have a question for Matt, which I'm going to read out. We know trust in developers and planning authorities is rock bottom. Without mutual trust, people and communities don't believe they can invest in their community or have a say in its future. How are we going to build that trust? Matt, that's coming your way because of the because of your work on this at Grosvenor in the Charter.
Sure. I mean, the truth is most developers are pretty hopeless engaging with communities. You know, you've got people who've gone and done land management at Reading, and I've got nothing against that, but a Tuesday night community engagement session doesn't make their heart sing. So the key issue for them is to stop outsourcing it and get that capacity in-house, and to have people in the business who are genuinely good at it and actually love doing it. So we've just launched a charter called Positive Space. And the key commitment in that is I've just started a 6-month internal capacity building program for 40 staff in Grosvenor to make sure we've got people who are any good at it. And then on that basis, you can start getting out and engaging with people a bit more skillfully. So often it's outsourced to consultancies, the brief is wrong, people confuse the political engagement with the community engagement with all the comms bit. So there's a very distinct discipline around good community engagement, which actually, to go back to Joe's point, actually I think we had a lot more of that capacity in the 90s. And I think it's been shredded, not just over the last 10 years of austerity, but over the last 15 years or so. And developers need to bring that back in-house. And actually so do planning teams as well in council. So you got a new chief planning officer this week. I really hope that she doesn't go for kind of big policy ideas and radical reform, because people don't want it. They want decent planning teams with good people who get on with stuff and set the bar high.
Matt, I want to applaud what you just said about bringing the that dialogue with communities and stakeholders and residents in-house, because you know, there are too many PR agencies out, you know, who are happily going to take the fee for selling somebody else's product, who will have those conversations, but will actually you know, protect their clients from any kind of material outcome from those conversations. And I think maybe it is quite important that we have those conversations as developers ourselves, and that we have the guts to do it, and of course as planning authorities and so on, and that actually we should feel going into those conversations a little nervous, because we don't know what we're going to hear, and that's the whole point of engagement. And we must be also nervous because of course we're trying to put something forward that we believe in, but other people may not, and you know, we need to have the willingness to change tack. I just there's just an interesting question that's come in here, which I just like to quickly answer, but somebody's put it in. They obviously know that I'm mad on CGI images and the images of the problems attached with CGI images. They say this: the system is imperfect. Developers outgun residents in fundamental ways. For example, in the expertise of the planning game, marketing, and CGI images. How do we level the playing fields? I'm just curious about that one, because I know that there is a tension in that. Of course, we commission we commission CGI images, and we try and make them look good for obvious reasons. But how do we make them fundamentally honest, and you know, how do we maintain integrity at the same time as showing something that we're attempting to sell?
Ironically, most of the CGI images look alike. They all look the same.
It's true. They've got the same sort of like few leaves sort of strewn across the path.
But the first thing is just stop consulting. Don't consult at any point. You know, you get in there and you shut up and listen. You know, and so one of the things we've started doing is community priority lists. You know, so what is it that people really want in a place? What are their priorities? And then you publish that, and you can be held to account for it. So the problem is, for a lot of developers, there's just not enough jeopardy.
Agree. Okay, here's a question for Joe. How do you reconcile the difference between communities' concerns and what a developer needs to provide to operate as a business? That's to Joe or Matt. Did you get the question? How do you reconcile the difference between communities' concerns and what a developer needs to provide to operate as a business?
That's not my concern.
Great. Matt,
I mean, you know, I'm coming from a perspective where I'm there as the advocate and the honest broker in a conversation about what an area needs. That's my role. The issue of viability, the cloak of viability, and all of that kind of stuff. You know, my interest is not in the bottom line of the developer I work with. I have utter respect for the developers that we work with. That's their concern to worry about. That's the question you should be asking them. That's not a question for me, because we're obviously here in a different role.
Any thoughts on that, Matt?
Well, the conversation, whenever we talk about community engagement, it always gets stuck on planning. and building new neighbourhoods, new development, rather than neighbourhood management, and how we look after the places where most of us live and get people much more directly and sort of seminally involved in that. And it's interesting. You go on sort of neighbourhood chat forums, and part of me is always thinking, my God, do I really want them anywhere near managing this neighbourhood? If you're being honest about it. And then the other part of you thinks, actually, we need such a much bigger conversation around here. And that piece about how do we connect people much more to what goes on in their neighbourhood? You know, that's the thing that's been brilliant about COVID, if there has been an upside. Suddenly people engaging in the local and those conversations and the mutual support and all of that. And the bit I'd love to see is councils and property companies stepping into that role of connector in existing neighbourhoods.
Sorry, I've got to come in. I've got to come in here. I can't. That's what local authorities do day in, day out, Matt. That is what our role. You know, it's not just a planning authority. We have a role to be that that body within a local area that has those conversations. We have those conversations, and we manage parts of the borough all the time. That's the bread and butter of what we do.
That's the joy of Croydon over Barnet.
Vidhya, you were going to come in there.
I can't comment on that, Matt.
Yeah, I suppose I wanted to say, I mean, what we've seen, at least from our perspective in COVID, is in lots of places quite a different way of working, which has been much more partnership oriented between community organisations and local authorities, where they've, you know, that because the need has been so great, community organisations have had to be part of the way in which local authorities reach out into communities and meet needs, particularly in more vulnerable communities. I think you know, if there's silver linings out of COVID, is that we sustain some of that way of working, so that strategically the community organisations start to sit around the table. Those organisations which have the depth of, and this is about managing place, not building new places, but that have the real depth of understanding about their local communities, are part of strategic decision making about how we meet need in those communities on an ongoing basis. So we, you know, there are these kind of silver linings, I think, we've had to work differently, and if we can sustain some of that, I think it'll be all for the better.
Thank you, Vidhya. Well, we're nearly out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up. But I just wanted to share. It's a CGI point, but somebody just in the comments said that one of the COVID effects is that people are behaving like they do in CGI renders for the first time, because they're sort of like walking around public space and you know, evenly dispersed, socially distant little clumps. I was going to say the exact opposite, which is we commissioned one recently, which is like that packed full of people attempting to show the kind of like vibrant high street. And now all I can do is look at it and go, no, it's not safe, stand apart. So anyway, thank you very much to the three panelists for joining today. I think we could have gone on longer with the questions that we've got. Maybe the conversation can continue outside of this on Twitter. I know that Vidhya and Matt are both on Twitter. Joe, I'm not sure, but we can pass on any questions via email and so on if there are any more interesting things that come up. I wanted to thank everybody, not only on the panel, but the organisers of the Quality of Life Foundation for putting on the event and helping it to run so smoothly, and also to everybody else for participating and joining in. So the next event in this series will be on the 9th of July, and the theme of that one is moving to access to nature, which is another one of the themes of our Quality of Life framework. And our panelists will include Louise Wyman, who's Strategic Director of Manchester City Council, Louise Clark, who is Associate on Biodiversity at Berkeley Group, and Matthew Wilson from Gardeners Questions. And it will be another really interesting conversation. So I think that's everything. I want to thank everybody again for coming. I've really enjoyed it. Sorry we couldn't have gone on for longer, but it's been brilliant to talk to you all this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jonny.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Jonny.
Bye-bye.
See
you. Jonny's gone. See you later.
Thank you, everyone.
Could have gone on for ages.
Bye. Bye. Matt, do you want to close the event and then we'll kick out?
No, I want to go on forever. Thanks ever so much, everyone. That was really good. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, thanks.
Lovely to see you all.
Okay, see you later.
See you, Joe. Bye, Vidhya.
See you later, Matt. See you, Vidhya.